Letters to Saleem. Saleem Kunam Katut. The Fundamental Principles of the Islamic System. Translated by Dr. Suhail Alam. Saleem, I received your letter. To tell you the truth, I've been waiting for it since my article on the Islamic system was published. Your doubts and concerns are not unexpected to me, and neither is your confusion and intellectual despair. Saleem. Keep in mind that once a belief has been passed down for generations and has become ingrained in the depths of the subconscious mind, it automatically seems to be based on solid truths. There may be a mountain of proofs and evidence developed in support of that belief, but those proofs and evidences would have been sculpted after the belief was already accepted. The preservation of self is a powerful force in man. In fact, his constant fear is defeat of himself, even on an intellectual plane. In an attempt to avoid intellectual defeat, proof and evidence is created, either consciously or subconsciously, for beliefs that are held either consciously or subconsciously. Defeat, even in minor situations, causes a feeling of being overwhelmed, leading to an inferiority complex and fear. This is why when people are confronted with something disproving their beliefs, their automatic reaction is to reject those new ideas and principles. Subconsciously believing one's own ideas and principles to be beyond doubt, they construct around themselves the fort of protection that we call blind following, or taqlid daima. This manner of blind following is the sworn enemy of knowledge and insight and is the first opponent of invitation to the truth and to revolutionary movements. A vivid display of this is given by the nations to whom the various prophets were sent. To every prophet's plea to follow the guidance, the masses invariably responded, "How can we leave what has been passed down to us from our ancestors? We are not prepared to do this."
وكذلك ما أرسلنا من قبلك في قرية من نذير إلا قال مترفوها إنا وجدنا آباءنا على أمة وإنا على آثارهم مقتدون.
Whenever we sent a warner before you, Muhammad, to any people, the wealthy ones among them said, "We found our fathers following a certain religion, and we will certainly follow in their footsteps." 43:23. Saleem, think how wrong a justification for one's principles this is, that it has been passed down by one's ancestors. If the germs of tuberculosis were passed down for generations from one's ancestors, then who wouldn't want to have them removed and be cured? So then why should the germs of false beliefs be considered so sacred that we, in fact, nourish them, keeping them closely until they course through our veins? Allah has given us, in His clear revelation, a touchstone, al-Furqan, the criterion, to distinguish between truth and falsehood. So you should take everything, even what I say, and test it against that touchstone before you draw your conclusions. By merely claiming that what I say is different than what anyone has told you before, neither is what I am saying proven wrong, nor what others are saying proven right. Never forget that. The judge of right and wrong or the health and disease of nations is only the Quran, not my or others' claims. That is why if any person sees my views as false, then he should provide reasons from the Quran. 111.
قل هاتوا برهانكم إن كنتم صادقين.
Bring your proof if you speak the truth. In the meantime, why don't you put aside everything I have just told you, and also put aside the beliefs which have been passed down to you from your ancestors? Then pause, reflect, and come to your own conclusion about what the Quran truly teaches us. For example, the Quranic punishment for adultery is specified but the punishment for drinking alcohol is not. Initially, you might conclude that the Quran does not consider drinking alcohol a real crime, and that is why the punishment is not specified. But this conclusion is against the other teachings of the Quran. 1. Drinking is an abomination of Satan's handiwork. 590. Thus it is a sinful deed.
رجس من عمل الشيطان.
2. Zina is considered a fahisha, great sin. 1732.
إنه كان فاحشة.
3. And whosoever follows the footsteps of Satan, then verily he commits fasha. 24:21.
فإنه يأمر بالفحشاء والمنكر.
From this, we see that drinking is included in the fasha category, because Satan orders to commit fasha, and drinking is a work of Satan. Therefore, since adultery is considered a fahisha and thus a punishable crime, so is drinking considered a fahisha and thus a punishable crime. This is why it would be incorrect to conclude that the Quran does not wish to punish drinking. Now the question arises that if a punishment for drinking is necessary, then why wasn't the punishment made clear as it was in the case of adultery? The non-Muslim critic may venture to say that this shows the Quran is an incomplete or imperfect book. It specifies punishments for some crimes and leaves out the punishments of others. Is the Quran incomplete? The response by most Muslims to this non-Muslim criticism is that punishments unspecified by the Quran were later specified by the Prophet. In this way, the Book of Allah was completed. This is called the Sunnah, and in fact when one mentions Deen, the usual understanding is the Quran and the Sunnah. But think Saleem. Did the above response truly answer the criticism? The criticism was about the deficiency of Allah, that he did not remember to put some details in the Quran, and as a result, revealed an imperfect book. Our response is that the Prophet, a human being, corrected this and filled in the blanks, therefore everything is okay? But the criticism of Allah still remains. The question now becomes, why couldn't Allah reveal the punishment for drinking just as he had revealed the punishment for adultery? Or in the same way that he specified the times for fasting, he could have explained the finer points of zakat. Why did a human being have to fill in these details? The non-Muslim again corners the Muslim on the deficiency of Allah and the Quran. Despite the honorable status of prophethood, even Muslims believe that Allah has the highest authority. No human being may add or subtract from Islam. This also moves us to question why Allah did not clarify and complete the beliefs himself. The strength of this criticism forced those Muslims intent on defending the status quo and following their ancestors, to devise a divine explanation. They invented the idea that there are two types of wahi, revelation, wahi matlu, the recited revelation, contained in the Quran, and wahi ghair matlu, the unrecited revelation, contained in the sayings of the Prophet, or the Sunnah. This belief answered the above criticisms by claiming that the Prophet did not clarify the Quran himself, rather Allah clarified those points, but his clarifications and completions were not contained in the Quran but rather in the collections of hadith. Hadith, a second source of revelation? Can you see, Saleem, how wrong and weak this hasty comeback is? First of all, a second form of revelation is not mentioned in the Quran. In the Quran, it clearly says that revelation is that which is contained within the pages of the Quran. For example,
واتل ما أوحي إليك من كتاب ربك لا مبدل لكلماته ولن تجد من دونه ملتحدا.
And recite what has been revealed to you, O Muhammad, of the book of your Lord. None can change his words, and you will find no other refuge than him. 1827. Throughout the entire Quran, there is not even a hint of the existence of revelation outside of the Quran, or that there are two types of revelation. Allah mentions only the Quran and gives his vow of protection only to the Quran. Interestingly, the belief of two types of revelation is present in the Jewish religion. Perhaps it is from there that Muslims have borrowed the idea. Then consider this as well, Saleem. What could be the purpose of sending a separate form of revelation besides the Quran? That same God, the sender of revelation, that same prophet, the recipient of revelation, the same language, Arabic, the same people addressed, mankind, for whom the revelation is sent, and both forms of revelation have equal authority, but despite the similarities, one form is within the Quran and the other is outside of it. The order to give zakat is in the Quran, but to give 2.5% is outside of the Quran. Couldn't the simple figure of 2.5% have been given in the Quran? Was there a concern of the Quran becoming too voluminous? This was the explanation given by Maulana Maududi, first volume of Tafimat, page 237. Think, Saleem. What could be Allah's reason for separating such closely related facts? What could be the purpose for ordering us to pay zakat through one type of revelation, and preserving that order in the Quran, whereas the clarification that zakat means paying 2.5% of your income is transmitted and preserved through another type of revelation instead of the Quran? This is the belief, anyway, about how Allah gave his revelation in two forms. The Prophet's mission. Now turn your attention towards the Prophet's mission of transmitting this second revelation, hadith, to us. The belief is that for one type of revelation, Quran, the Prophet took enough care to have it written in a complete and precise fashion. From start to finish, he oversaw its preservation in writing as well as in memory, by checking and double-checking his companions' recitation, listening repeatedly to them reciting each word. In this way, he ensured the preservation of this revelation in the pages of the Quran and gave it to the Ummah for eternity. In regards to the Quran, his duty as a messenger of Allah was accomplished. Now, if there was more revelation, that is, hadith, then the Prophet's duty should have been to transmit that as well, in a fashion similar to that of the Quran. But neither did he order it to be written down anywhere, nor did he oversee its memorization, nor did he compile some sort of collection of it, nor did he make any sort of accommodation whatsoever for its preservation. Rather, even if someone, out of goodwill, attempted to record anything on his own, he stopped them saying, "Don't record anything of me other than the Quran." Sahih Muslim. Hadith scholars claim that shortly before his death, the Prophet allowed some hadith writing. But still, he neither commanded it nor double-checked it to ensure its quality as he did for the Quran. Just think, Saleem, that if the deen is supposed to be the collection of the Quran, recited revelation, and the Sunnah, unrecited revelation, then why was one part preserved so completely and carefully while the other part was simply left alone? Does this mean, God forbid, that the Prophet was remiss in his duty to transmit the message of Allah to mankind? Why weren't hadith recorded like the Quran? It is said that the memory of the Arabs was so strong that they memorized everything verbally, and this is why almost no hadith were written down. But Saleem, use your head to really think about this. If the Arabs' memory was indeed so strong that hadith did not need to be written down, then why was it necessary to have the Quran written down? And then also, why would the Quran be memorized so carefully word by word, and then the memorization checked and double-checked by the Prophet, whereas not a shred of similar effort was made for hadith? Why were hadith not memorized and then checked by the Prophet? It should be kept in mind that hadith are not even the exact words of the Prophet. The definition of hadith is that it is a narration, told in the words of the narrator. The narrator himself does not even claim that these are the exact words of the Prophet, rather he gives the gist of what the Prophet said. When this is the case, then the issue of strong memory is irrelevant. The mission of the companions. Having seen the role of Allah and the Prophet in regards to the Quran versus the Hadith, let us now look at the role of the rightly guided caliphs, Khalifa ar-Rashidin, in the revelation. It is well known how diligently they prepared carefully checked copies of the Quran and then distributed them to the different corners of the Ummah. They even prepared specially verified standard Qurans against which all other Qurans could be checked. If any discrepancy was found, the Quran in question would be destroyed. They did all of this for that one half of the deen, the Quran. But for the other half, the Hadith, not only did they not do anything to preserve it themselves, not only did they more than once order collections of Hadith to be burned, but whenever it became known that someone was personally attempting to record Hadith, they immediately stopped him and depending on the situation even administered punishment for it. I have already explained this to you in detail, in my book Maqami Hadith. What does all this mean? Just think, Saleem. What conclusion is this investigation leading you to? In the end, don't you arrive at the conclusion that these beliefs about Hadith, the unrecited revelation, Wahi Ghair Matlu, must have been started much after the Prophet's time? That it was not according to the wishes of Allah, nor the Prophet, nor the rightly guided caliphs? At that time, only one type of revelation was accepted, the one preserved forever in the Quran. This is what Allah gave to the Prophet, what the Prophet transmitted to the Ummah, and what his companions spread to mankind. Listen to this again, Saleem. That the Prophet did not collect and transmit the Hadith to the Ummah. If it were really a part of the deen, then wouldn't it be his duty to personally ensure the reliable transmission of this part of the deen to his Ummah before his departure, particularly since there shall be none after him? But the collection of Hadith was carried out individually, much after the death of the Prophet. The most reliable collection, Sahih Bukhari, was not compiled until the 3rd century A.H. Its author Imam Bukhari died in 256 A.H. As for the claim that there were hadith written before Sahih Bukhari, those hadith were very few in number compared to the amount amassed by Bukhari, and in addition, were eventually lost to the Ummah. Do you think that if the hadith were really so important, then the Prophet would have left us in this way? From this, it becomes clear that our beloved Prophet did not consider it a part of the deen at all. This is the only possible conclusion. Now ask all the strict proponents of hadith what I have asked above, none of them will be able to give you a satisfying answer. Through hadith, a door was opened. Now listen to how this false belief introduced so many terrible things into the deen. The Quran was present amongst Muslims in its pristine form, and Allah himself had taken custodianship over it, therefore, not even a single letter of the Quran could be tampered with. In contrast, there was no standard against which to check the collections of hadith as they were produced, yet they were decreed as an essential complement of the Quran. Now imagine, by doing this, how wide the door was swung open for tampering with Islamic principles. Before, Islam's message was safe and perfectly preserved. Now, whoever wished could create an order by himself, ascribe to it 3 or 4 famous narrators of hadith, thus ascribing it to the Prophet, and then his personal order would become a part of Islam. There was no means for anyone to test a hadith against a verified text to determine whether it was truly the Prophet's saying. The only means was to determine the trustworthiness of the isnad, chain of narrators, attached to the hadith. Think, Saleem, what large doors for corruption were opened in that deen that Allah and His Messenger gave to us with such care and consideration. Even the Prophet could not alter its message or follow something other than it.
قلنا يكون لي أن أبدله من تلقاء نفسي إن أتبع إلا ما يوحى إلي.
Say it is not for me to, of my own accord, to change it. I follow not except what is revealed unto me. Quran 10:15.
تنزيل من رب العالمين ولو تقول علينا بعض الأقاويل لأخذنا منه باليمين ثم لقطعنا منه الوتين فما منكم من أحد عنه حاجزين.
This is the revelation sent down from the Lord of the worlds. And if he, Muhammad, had forged a false saying concerning us, we surely would have seized him by his right hand, and then certainly would have cut off his life artery, and none of you could withhold us from punishing him. 69:43-47. But now whoever controlled hadith had total freedom to insert false sayings. Whatever orders they wanted, they could create and ascribe to the Prophet. And if one tells them that these so-called sayings are actually changes in the teachings of the Quran or that it is in addition to it, which even the Prophet did not have the authority to do, then the answer is that these changes and additions are not from the Prophet himself, rather they are from Allah, since hadith are supposedly unrecited revelation. They say that these changes, amendments, and abrogations are actually from Allah, through the Prophet, narrated by a chain of various past Muslims. Even Quranic orders were not safe. But it does not stop there, Saleem. The hadith, unrecited revelation, not only specified those things Allah left unspecified in the Quran, it even changed and abrogated those things Allah specified in the Quran. For example, the Quran gives the crime of zina the punishment of 100 lashes. But according to hadith, this punishment is only for fornicators, unmarried, whereas the punishment for adulterers, married but unfaithful, is stoning to death, a punishment which has no basis in the Quran. In another place, the Quran says that every person can make a will for his worldly possessions, whatever remains may then be distributed according to the inheritance laws of the Quran. But in hadith, not only does it say that the will can only include a third of the possessions, but also that it cannot be left for family members. And so on. Thus, before, the criticism was just that since the Quran did not specify everything, it is, God forbid, deficient. In defense of this claim, the idea of unrecited revelation was coined. But as we have seen above, now even the clearly specified orders in the Quran are considered deficient. Their completion and amendments were made through the hadith, the unrecited revelation, the doors for inserting whatever one wanted into Islam, were swung wide open. The scholars of hadith are witnesses to the fact that fabricated hadith number in the thousands. So Saleem, have you understood anything? I suspect questions must be bubbling in your mind that 1. Still, the answer to the initial criticism has not been clarified, as far as why the Quran left some parts unspecified, and 2. How or why did the beliefs about hadith and unrecited revelation enter into Islam in the first place? You've done the same thing most people do when confronted with an idea contrary to their traditional beliefs. Without even taking the time to understand it, they begin to question that idea. As I said before, beliefs passed down generation after generation eventually enter into the depths of the subconscious of mankind as eternal truths, and they do not easily leave their precious homes in our hearts. Keeping this in mind, let's look at your questions. Why the Quran left some parts unspecified? You already know that the Quran contains the system of laws for every area of life, for all time. The two parts of any system of laws are 1. The principles and 2. The practical implementation of those principles. In the Islamic system, the principles are those unchanging independent values and eternal laws contained within the Quran. Here, we will call the practical implementation of these principles bylaws, laws derived from other laws. Therefore, we can consider the Islamic system of laws as 1. The principles contained within the Quran, and 2. The bylaws derived from the Quran. Keep in mind that whereas the principles are eternally unchangeable, as different practical situations present themselves to civilization through time, the implementation of those principles may change to meet changing demands, in order to provide satisfying solutions. This is why the bylaws, implementation of the eternal principles, cannot themselves remain fixed for all time. As you know, trying to cure every illness with the same medicine can lead to death. Now are you beginning to understand Allah's purpose for leaving some parts unspecified? The Quran has given us all the basic principles, eternal unchangeable laws, for guiding human civilization, but it has not specified every detail of how to implement those principles, bylaws. The reason is that not a single letter of the Quran is subject to change. Therefore, if the Quran had itself specified the details of all bylaws, then for all time to come, no change could occur in the system of laws. If Allah Himself had specified the bylaws for all time, then none of us would have any authority to say otherwise. This type of system, in which even the practical implementation, or bylaws, are fixed, cannot be applied to every area of life for all time. The downfall of other religions as a system of life. Do you know why the Jewish, Christian, and Hindu religions are so unsuccessful today? Do you know why their followers have disbanded them, or follow in name only? Actually, these followers did not leave their religions happily, they left it because of great compulsion. What was that compulsion, you ask? Since those religious rituals, traditions and bylaws were specified at a certain point in time and received a decree of being unchangeable, as the times and contexts changed, the implementation of the unchangeable laws, bylaws, of these religions was unable to meet the demands of the times. However, the vanguard of the religions, for reasons I described earlier, continued insisting on those rituals, traditions, and bylaws, claiming that these were unchangeable and intended for all time. This clash continued until eventually, the citizens became so frustrated by the demands of the day, that they totally discarded their religious system of laws. And because their divine books were not present in their pristine forms, they were unable to return to their eternal religious laws and were thus unable to revitalize their religion according to the needs of their time. That is why, along with discarding their bylaws, they actually discarded their religions as a system of life. You see, for most of them, these practical implementations of principles, bylaws, had become their whole religion, that is, they had lost the eternal principles and had nothing left but bylaws. Now that they were forced to discard that as well, they were left with nothing. So you see, Saleem, how the Jews' bylaws in the Talmud, the Christians' bylaws by St. Paul, and the Hindus' bylaws by Mannuji, all of which are considered eternal and unchangeable, became useless, leaving its followers no choice but to put them aside due to the demands of time and change? In contrast, while the Quran established the eternal laws guiding the development and evolution of mankind, it also accommodated the changing demands of civilization. This is why Islam's system of life, embracing both the need for permanence as well as flexibility, has the capacity to become the eternal system of life for all mankind, for all time. And so it is clear, Saleem, that the Quran did not provide all the bylaws, those specifics, for example, punishment for drinking, which the non-Muslim critics claimed was a deficiency, because Allah wanted them to remain flexible and adaptable to man's needs. If the bylaws regarding these issues were to be eternally fixed, then the Quran would have specified those things itself, of which there are many examples in the Quran. This is why if at some time a group derives specific bylaws based on the eternal laws of the Quran and says that from that point on they cannot change, it would destroy the foundation of this dynamic system of life, eliminating its capacity to be the eternal system of life for mankind. Just think, Saleem. Could a government operate if it could only ask for 2.5% income tax on its people's surplus assets once a year, no matter what the nation's condition? The Quran, by giving the order of zakat, income tax, and leaving its particulars undetermined, gave each Islamic government of different time periods the ability to implement the order according to their needs. We will discuss zakat in more detail in the future. If the Khalifa ar-Rashidin judged that according to their needs, 2.5% was appropriate, then that should become the Islamic law of the land, Sharia. And if today some Islamic government judges that according to the current needs, 20% zakat is necessary, then that should become the Islamic law. And when the Islamic economic system, Nizam-e-Rububiyyat, attains its final stages of establishment, then zakat's implementation will become something even more. For explanation, see my book Nizam-e-Rububiyyat. These are the reasons, Saleem, why the Quran left the bylaws unspecified. But by forcing upon ourselves all the bylaws that our ancestors implemented, we have crippled this eternal system of life. You know even better than I do that some Muslims of the present day are being estranged from or are even revolting against Islam because the temporally defined bylaws of our ancestors are being enforced upon them even though they do not fit the demands of the present time. But if you present to these Muslims the principles of the Quran and tell them to apply the eternal laws and derive the bylaws according to their present needs and within the limits of those principles, watch how they joyfully pledge allegiance to that system of life. Now let's examine your other concern: how, why, and who decreed these parts as unchangeable, or in other words, how were the beliefs of unrecited revelation, wahi ghair matlu, introduced into Islam? How the bylaws became unchangeable. As was mentioned above, the Quran left bylaws unspecified in order to allow the different Muslim governments through time the ability to specify them according to their own respective needs. The Prophet commanded the establishment of an Islamic government and, according to the needs of his time, he specified the bylaws for his nation. After this, during the time of the rightly guided caliphs, Khalifa ar-Rashidun, additions and modifications were continuously made according to their needs. The caliphs, at times, gave judgments that were different than those of the Prophet, and they did this saying that this was due to the different demands of their conditions. Saleem. You will be shocked to know that the beliefs of the unrecited revelation, wahi ghair matlu, cannot be traced back to the period of the Prophet or even that of the caliphs and companions. Their period was not even aware of this term. They only recognized one type of revelation, the one preserved within the Quran. Outside of it, there was no revelation. That is why outside of the Quran, nothing was considered unchangeable. However, after this period, the caliphate turned into a hereditary monarchy, and the rulers granted themselves total power over affairs of state. As far as the affairs of religion, they commissioned the scholars of that time, hand-picked by them, of course, to deal with the affairs of religion. Thus, church and state were effectively separated, and the procedure outlined in the Quran for implementing the Islamic principles and deriving bylaws, that is, through the medium of the government of the Islamic system, was wiped out. Giving the scholars the benefit of the doubt, it can be said that due to the above situation, the scholars needed to take emergency measures. The government had given the scholars the right to derive religious bylaws. However, the scholars were genuinely worried that the rulers were not interested in Islam and would not enforce them. Furthermore, if it was claimed that the scholars' bylaws only applied to their own time, after time, different groups might break off forming their own sets of bylaws according to their beliefs and desires, and eventually the Ummah would deteriorate into utter chaos. The kings didn't care, as long as everyone obeyed them. The emergency measures the scholars took to solve this predicament was to ascribe their own interpretations to the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, claiming that he had received it through divine revelation. This way, their laws and interpretations received the divine seal of approval and would have to be followed by the masses. Deviation would not be allowed. Now, when Muslim scholars deriving bylaws based upon their own interpretation confronted scholars preaching divine bylaws from the Prophet, it is obvious that everyone would feel forced to accept the latter. Thus, anarchy was averted and unity was restored. Instead of leaving the Ummah unbridled and allowing varying people's opinions and reasoning to rule, scholars leashed them by way of taqlid, blind following, into very strict limits. The Ummah no longer came together to decide how best to implement the Quran. Due to separation of church and state, they were now forced to just blindly follow what the scholars claimed were divine bylaws, given by the Prophet. Any deviation would be considered a crime. The scholars' aim was to unite everyone by forcing all the Muslims of their time to follow one set of bylaws. However, they empowered these bylaws so much that in time they were decreed as eternally unchangeable. At this time, I will not discuss the direct conspiracy of the Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians against Islam, to take revenge upon Muslims by inserting their own beliefs into Islam by way of relations and hadith. I have written much about this in my book Maqami Hadith. For such a critical moment in Islamic history, when kings took power and separated church and state, this seemed a suitable temporary solution, but such a huge door for the insertion of false hadith was opened that all one had to do was to attach Qala Rasulullah, the Prophet said, along with a few respectable narrators, and one's belief could become a part of the deen. It would become an unchangeable portion of the Islamic law. But as long as there was a separation church and state, the question of whether the bylaws should remain unchangeable was irrelevant because the scholars' decrees, being passed down on the basis of taqlid as unchangeable, had no true impact on society. Having been separated from the state, these beliefs became mere rituals. If zakat was 2.5% or 40%, both cases represented nothing more than ritual. Wherever there are Muslim governments today in which there is a separation of church and state, their religious bylaws and decrees are nothing more than rituals. There, the government tax is separate, and zakat is given merely as a good deed. This is why the issue of changeable or unchangeable bylaws was irrelevant. That is, until the formation of Pakistan, because the very reason for its birth was to actively implement religion and Islamic law. Even those in favor of implementing traditional Islamic law, with unchangeable bylaws, trembled at the question of whether or not Pakistan could function under these unchangeable set of laws and details formulated many years ago. Those in favor of it were persistent, and felt that the Islamic law should be followed just as it is without being touched. These people were not concerned with whether they would be able to function in the current day or not. This is the characteristic product of taqlid, blind following, literally, being led on a leash, that the only concern is with proper intentions and prescribed means, but the concern never extends to the end results of those actions. Do you remember our trip to the newspaper press in Delhi? There was a printing press machine operating at full speed. Its numerous pieces, clattering loudly, provided a dramatic example of wondrous machinery at work. However, no paper was fed into the machine, so despite the spectacle nothing was being printed. Saleem, the Muslims' machinery, praying, fasting, zakat, etc., has been on for many centuries, but just like this press machine, nothing is being produced. Olaika habitat amalahum, they are those whose works are without result, dalasayamum, their efforts are in vain. But today Saleem, we have received an opportunity where tyranny and domination have receded, and we have the power and freedom to create whatever form of government we want. We control whatever form of constitution we want to implement. After centuries, a chance has come in which we can write our fate with our own pens. If we do not take advantage of this huge opportunity that Allah has blessed us with now, perhaps the Quran will never become the true constitution of our lives. We will never be able to take the pure breath of freedom. Saleem, how can I express to you the anguish and raging storm that is within my chest, which has made my nights sleepless and my days restless? You don't understand, Saleem, that when I look at Pakistan both far and wide, I see no concern for character nor desire for profound thought. All I can do is sigh and lament the oppression of taqlid and the death of the truth-seekers. Saleem, I am continually haunted by the fact that those calling for the traditional system of Islamic law desire to implement the bylaws, the Sharia, specified over 1,000 years ago merely because they were decreed as unchangeable, and that is why they will only accept that Islamic law, one that will never be able to operate in our times. Muslims will be so dismayed and disappointed by its failure that they may never again consider implementing Islamic law in their countries. And in this way, the great blessing that Allah has given us will remain unimplemented due to our unfortunate actions. This will not only be an injustice for Muslims, all of humanity will be deprived of the light meant to elevate mankind to new levels. Unfortunately, after this letter was published, exactly what I was afraid of happened. The same old proponents of Islamic law implemented their brand of Islam in Pakistan, and it was proven impossible to use. Iman in the Prophet, Saw. Saleem, you are also wondering that if the Quran only gave us the eternal laws and principles, and each ummah was supposed to determine the exact details according to the needs of its times, then what role does having Iman in the Prophet play? This question of yours shocked me because you never used to ask such silly questions. Just think, if someone says that the Quran is the word of Allah, then what proof can he bring that the Quran wasn't actually written by our Prophet? History itself says that the Quran was given to the world by the Prophet, so why is it considered the word of Allah? The only proof is that the Prophet himself said that this is not his own work, but that it is the word of Allah. That is why until someone has Iman in the Prophet, he cannot truly believe that the Quran is the word of Allah and that the Quran itself is the constitution for the kingdom of Allah. Then also think about this, Saleem. That it was the Prophet who enlightened us to the reality that we, mankind, have to implement the Quranic principles and derive the bylaws ourselves. If the Prophet had not demonstrated this, then would any Muslim know how to go about Islamic lawmaking? Actually, the part of the seerah that must be followed is that which has been stated as the best example for all of humanity until the end of the world. The implementation of the Quran's eternal laws, bylaws, are, by necessity, inextricably bound to the limits of the time and place in which they were implemented. But the wisdom and light seen in the Sirah is beyond space and time. We see in the Sirah the character of our Prophet. We see how he was able to guide mankind to its proper destination, engendering freedom of thought, destroying the chains and shackles in which mankind was bound. These chains and shackles of tyranny were placed in the guise of kings, capitalists, and priests, but the real damage was done when they eventually became ingrained in our own conscious and subconscious philosophies. The Quran states that
كان لبشر أن يؤتيه الله الكتاب والحكم والنبوة ثم يقول للناس كونوا عبادا لي من دون الله ولكن كونوا ربانيين بما كنتم تعلمون الكتاب وبما كنتم تدرسون.
379. It is not possible for any human being unto whom Allah has given the scripture and wisdom and the prophethood that he should afterwards have said unto mankind, be slaves of me instead of Allah, but what he said was, be faithful servants of the Lord by virtue of your constant teaching of the scripture and of your constant study thereof. One mission of the Prophet was, through unprecedented example, to demonstrate how people can become guided and enlightened. In other words, how people can develop a direct relationship with their God, without barriers. The means for this connection and relationship is the Quran. The Prophet himself was the first one to provide a concrete example of how this can be accomplished. The Ummah, after the Prophet, was supposed to follow this example and keep it continuous. However, the Ummah eventually veered off this path and again placed barriers between themselves and Allah, the very same barriers that the Quran had come to remove. The very same barriers that the Prophet showed us how to remove. These barriers in some cases were politicians, and in other cases priests who made their followers worship laws and concepts that were of their own creation, instead of Allah's. These priests took the shelter of the original scholars and in other cases found shelter under the Prophet himself, through stories and narrations. This is in spite of the fact that neither the original scholars, nor the Prophet taught that Quranic applications were meant to be unchangeable until the end of the world. So Saleem, a day should come when these wrong ways are discovered and left behind, and those ways are adopted that will once again allow a direct relationship between God and his people. In my opinion, Pakistan is providing that chance, but even now if those barriers between Allah and his people remain standing, meaning if the government became subject to the politicians, or else subject to the scholar-worshipping practices of the priests, then this broken relationship between Allah and his people will remain broken. This, Saleem, is the reason for the dreamlessness of my teary eyes, and the hidden anguish of my heart. With this last bit, Saleem, hopefully you will have concluded that the Islamic system is not simply a collection of rules and laws to be followed by a nation mechanically and robotically. What is law? But what is a law? It is the means by which man is stopped from committing those deeds that lead to disruption and imbalance in his society. For the achievement of this end, different nations or kingdoms or governments have implemented different measures. Between different governing bodies, there are often similarities. For example, the punishment for murder by British law is death, and this is also the punishment according to the Islamic law. So in this regard, there is no difference between the two laws. Now, let's say hypothetically, that all of Britain's punishments for crimes are changed to agree with the punishments of Islamic law, called hudud. Can one then deduce that the British way of life has become the Islamic way of life? Definitely not. Now let's take one more step. If our Muslim governments also implement all their punishments according to Islamic law, does that necessarily mean that our government has become Islamic? Definitely not. By this, Saleem, you will have understood that simply implementing the Islamic law is not what is meant by the Islamic system. The most we can say is that the Islamic laws are a part of the Islamic system. Interestingly, there often on one hand will be an attempt to enforce these Islamic laws, while on the other hand will be an attempt to find loopholes in them. You might be surprised at what I am saying. But Saleem, what I am saying is reality. If you don't believe me, then take a look at those books for yourself and read, such as Imam Ibn Qayyim's Ilan al-Mokin, in which some of these loopholes of Islamic law are rebutted. For your interest, I will only give you one example of such loophole, which will show you exactly of what kind of loopholes I speak. Two men broke into and robbed a house, but were caught in the act and brought before a court. The crime was evident. According to Islamic law, the hands of these thieves should have been cut. But now watch how these two thieves escaped their punishment. One of the men says that he only broke open the door, and that is not robbery. The second man says, indeed I took whatever valuable items I found in the house. However, items found in an open house cannot be called private or protected, and since robbery only involves those items that are private or protected, I did not steal either. The court was thus unable to punish the two thieves. Saleem, these kinds of loopholes occur in court every day. The better part of a lawyer's job is often spent in such loophole manipulation. This demonstrates how mere implementation of Islamic law cannot engender rectification in people, which should be the ultimate goal. The change in their hearts will come only when the Quranic system of Rububiyat is established. And what is Quranic Rububiyat? I cannot explain it all in this letter, Saleem. I will explain it another time. See my book, Nizam-e Rububiyat, the Quranic economic system, though even this book will not be totally comprehensive. The Quranic system of Rububiyat encompasses the social life of man in the same way that the vast environment surrounds his physical life. Although human beings are attached to the massive earth for their existence, the earth does not interfere in their freedom. It is important to understand that in this system, the universe was created for a purpose and goal, and it is steadily and surely progressing towards that goal. In summary, 1. Mankind was created for a purpose and goal, and the struggles they endure should lead towards that goal. 2. The physical universe proceeds towards that goal without choice or intention. 3. But mankind has the freedom of will, the power of choice and intention. And because of this, mankind can only proceed to its goal through its choices and way of life. 4. The name of this way of life is Deen, meaning the Islamic way of life, whose basis is the oneness of the Creator, oneness of law, oneness of mankind, and oneness of purpose. 5. The major outcome of this system is that every individual of that society is provided with all the requirements to excel and develop all of his capabilities and powers. 6. According to this system of life, it is the responsibility of the government to provide all the necessities of life for its citizens. Therefore, it is obvious that the laws of crime and punishment, whose goal is to deal with those who break the laws, are only one aspect of this all-encompassing system. Until now, our discussion has been limited to how to put into action and implement the Islamic laws. So do not think that I have covered all there is to the Islamic system, rather I have only covered one aspect of it. You won't fully understand how this constitution of laws I have described becomes a part of the whole system and achieves the great goals Allah intended, until you fully understand the entire system with its aims and goals in your sights. Now Saleem, the response to your last inquiry. You will agree that there are some matters the details of which are not mentioned in either Quran or Hadith. Now, if we keep with the traditional principle that only the Prophet can determine the applications of revelation, then who will determine the details of these unmentioned matters since the prophethood ended long ago? This is the problem that gave rise to the belief that at the end of every century there shall be a mujaddid, a revolutionary, or a Mahdi at the end of time. This is how those seeking prophethood, or its power, took advantage and were able to pry open the door of prophethood. However, if we realize that the application and implementation of the Islamic principles is not the duty of a few special individuals, but rather is the duty of the entire nation, then there will be no need for a mujaddid or a Mahdi. Those chairs of prophethood will not be set out, nor will anyone have the audacity to sit in them. Renewal and revolution in guidance will be maintained, continuing unbroken. But Muslims did not do this. And after they followed the wrong path and came across its complications, they devised solutions that caused their worries and problems to further multiply. You may say that for such problems, the door to ijtihad remains open. This is what I say as well. The difference is that you say that the ijtihad already done cannot be further changed or improved, whereas, I say that areas whose demands change according to the needs of the time are indeed subject to revised ijtihad. Those items that Allah has left open for interpretation cannot have eternally unchangeable ijtihad. But of course, it should be kept in mind that we may benefit by studying the ijtihad of previous times. But this ijtihad should not be done on an individual basis. Rather, the delegates of the Ummah, after thought and reflection upon all the conditions of society, should do ijtihad and then derive the applications of Quranic principles, bylaws. This is the way, Saleem, that we can, in the light of Allah's eternal laws, answer the demands of each time, coming up with new remedies for the ever-changing illnesses of society. This is Adin al-Mubin, the Islamic system of life that will shine its light upon the entire world, for all time to come.